ending wars is easy if one side surrenders and capitulates, and the other side gets what they want. And the reason that this, war hasn't come to a settlement yet is that the two sides have, remain really far apart, with President Putin still making, demands. Reportedly, for example, in Riyadh, Russian demand was repeated, that NATO should go back to its 1997 borders, so that would mean Poland, etc., would have to leave NATO. So these are still very sort of extensive demands on NATO, let alone Ukraine. And the Ukrainians obviously have been fighting a war to prevent that, because they understand that it would mean that they no longer had a state, an independent state. And the Russians have been clear that that is their intent. So it's very difficult unless one side capitulates. And I think what President Trump has basically done is to identify that he has a lot of leverage with one side, because it's very dependent on American support and financing and weapons, and very, much less leverage with the other. He's also, I think, identified that there's a lot more to be gained, by cutting a deal with the Russians. They have more to offer, larger economy, all that sort of thing. He did make this proposal to the Ukrainians. It was, in fact, originally Zelenskyy's idea. What the Treasury Secretary admitted to say in his interview was that when Zelensky got the actual details of the U.S. proposal, what it says is that the Ukraine should hand over 50% of all its natural resources, infrastructure, ports, etc., 50% of revenues to the U.S. in perpetuity. And there was nothing in the deal about security guarantees, and that the kinds of things that Zelensky was trying to get. So it was a deal that was clearly designed to be rejected.
Marc, one thing that I think is notable about this entire conversation is the role of a Treasury Secretary being part of this negotiation. How should we think about that?
Well, I mean, actually, American Treasury Secretaries are unique in the world, in the sense that one of the most powerful foreign policy tools and weapons of coercion that the United States has is the Treasury and its sanctions apparatus. And they are extremely powerful, and it makes a lot of sense that they should be involved. The Secretary talked about lifting sanctions. Of course, both the EU and the US have imposed sanctions on Russia. But essentially, if the US were to lift sanctions, that would be the end of it, because the EU simply doesn't have the kinds of depth of enforcement personnel and expertise that the U.S. has. It doesn't have the U.S. dollar as a point of leverage, and it has no experience whatsoever with enforcing secondary sanctions. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he's involved.
I think what's also fascinating and intriguing about your column is that this isn't about an end to the war, but about the United States and President Trump negotiating a reset with Russia. Again, your view, but is it because, explain that, I guess I want to ask you, and then is it because there is so much more potentially that the U.S. has to gain? Is it business interests? Is it geopolitically? Is it in terms of maybe keeping nuclear war at bay? Is that it? And if so, is that such a bad thing?
Well, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, after the Riyadh meeting, said very clearly that, there was enormous opportunities to be had, both geopolitical and economic, for the United States in securing this deal. What I was trying to say is that if you look at this, the Trump administration's approach in terms of them trying to get what the Europeans want and the Ukrainians want, which is the best possible deal to retain Ukraine's status as a sovereign state, retain as much land as it can, etc. If that is the goal, then nothing that President Trump has done makes sense, because he handed over some of the most important demands that the Russians have made before talks have even begun. And in fact, in Riyadh, setting up teams to begin talks on a ceasefire was just one of the outcomes, and not the one that was first listed. You know, the first one that was listed was to restore diplomatic relations and economic relations between Russia and the US. That's also why Ukraine and Europe were not at the table, because it wasn't a deal that was primarily about them. The difficulty for Ukraine and for the Europeans is that once that's understood, then Ukraine and its ceasefire, they become just a lesser tool in a wider deal.